The following reflections provide a brief snapshot of the past 50 years based upon a review of OASW's minutes and archival documents. I'm going to highlight a sampling of some of the themes addressed over the past 50 years. So I'm going to be talking fast. And there'll be all kinds of gaps, things I won't have a chance to talk about. Clearly, when I was going back over these documents, what was most striking was the fact that society and the communities in which we live and work look very, very different today than they did 5 decades ago. Ontario's been shaped by immigration, which has increased the diversity in our communities, shift in Ontario's economic fortunes. We now have a rapidly growing, aging society. There's been a significant impact by the women's movement as women have entered the workforce and related to gaining reproductive rights. The size and structure of family units have changed, as has the nature of employment and the rapidity with which change is occurring, and the list goes on and on and on. The profession also has changed quite remarkably. Some of the changes include, but are by no means limited to, the evolution of social work practice, which has been influenced by a changing focus in education and training, as well as the regulatory status of the profession. Public policy has influenced how services have been shaped and funded. There's been growth in independent practice, and the impact of technology has really had a very, very significant impact on how we communicate with one another and how we do our work. While many gains have been made, common themes continue to surface over the decades related to fundamental advocacy concerns that OASW has championed on behalf of the profession. However, how the issues have been manifest and the manner in which the advocacy has been conducted has varied over time. OASW's advocacies in the 60s and today still focus on social justice related to vulnerable populations and marginalized groups, poverty reduction, as well as promotion of the profession and professional advocacy, which continues to be driven by a lack of understanding of the profession's role, skills, and training, and our contribution to the society, as well as concerns about the erosion in supports and salaries. The 1960s was a very different time as we look at what was happening then as compared to now. The median age was 27. Families had on average 3.8 children. Less than 1/3 of women with school-age children were in the workforce. Ontario was experiencing a tremendous economic prosperity spurred by the manufacturing sector. A strong labor movement improved salaries and benefits. Job seekers flocked to Ontario from across the country, and internationally they came here as well, particularly from Europe. And funding increased for social programs, especially in children's services, as did positions for social work, and CASers were a major employer during that time. Preceding the 1960s, beginning in 1955, concern about the inability to include Ontario social workers in new regulations under the Child Welfare Act precipitated discussions by representatives from community-based chapters of CASW about the need for social workers in Ontario to have a provincial voice. Between 1960 and 1962, a broad-based Ontario committee provided leadership in bringing this idea to fruition, and would appear that there were at least 20 to 25 individuals who played pivotal roles in moving that forward. Members of the committees worked in such settings as CASs, JF&CS, the Hospital for Sick Children, the Ontario Hospital Social Services Department, Ontario Welfare Council, and what has now become, which was then rather, the School of Social Work at U of T and St. Patrick's College School of Social Welfare, which is now Carleton. In 1962, The Association of Social Workers was formed under the presidency of Francis Philpott as an Ontario division of CASW. Membership was restricted to individuals from accredited programs and to those deemed to have the equivalency to social work training. The membership at that time was just a few hundred. In 1964, OASW was incorporated and the term professional was added to the name at the suggestion of government to help differentiate association members from others in the field without professional social work qualifications. A major focus in the latter part of the 60s was concern about the status and recognition of the profession as well, and this led in 1972 to interest in some form of regulation for the profession and what this might look like. During the 1970s, Ontario's economy continued to be robust, employment rates were high, and publicly funded programs continued to expand. Consciousness raising as a result of the women's movement resulted in growing demands by the public for the removal of discriminatory practices in public and private sector organizations, and changes were demanded in the nature and manner in which services were being offered to women. And it was in that era that we began to see the emergence of rape crisis centers and women's centers and a number of other services that were dedicated to women. Within the profession, an increasing focus on practice centered around individual and family systems, and we began to see the emergence of family therapy. We also witnessed a growing interest in private practice, which led OASW to establish a policy regarding the qualifications and experience required for those in private practice. At that time, the association was also actively involved in consultations related to women's issues that in regard to discriminatory practice, in regard to fertility and reproduction, inequities in family law and employment practices. And for example, OASW participated in a task force studying the relationships of social work to the status of women. Concerns about the impact of rising food costs during that time also led OASW to participate in an anti-poverty coalition. Furthermore, concern about employment practices and the level of salaries within organizations that employed social workers was a significant concern, and OASW actively monitored employment practices and developed an array of materials and guidelines related to hiring, salaries, and guidelines that would determine how bargaining disputes were handled. So it was a very important time. The quest for legislation took the form of a bill submitted to MCSS seeking regulation of practice. However, the government at the time was at best very ambivalent about regulating social work and in fact questioned whether we were a profession. And rather sadly, there was a small but very vocal group within the profession who actively challenged the need for public protection and the underlying motives of the association in seeking regulation, accusing OASW of elitism and an attempt to professionalize practice. Ultimately, they were successful in stalling talks with government. By the 1980s, OASW's economy was slowly beginning to contract, and we were seeing signs of it with organizational restructuring beginning to happen. It was certainly happening in healthcare, but it was during this era that pay equity legislation came in a response to pressure from women to be treated equitably, particularly related to salaries. The association undertook a number of major initiatives during the 80s and really thought big. For example, the association established the Voluntary College of Certified Social Workers, and that was a self-governing or self-regulatory body. And there was a requirement to have joint membership in both organizations, and that resulted in a sharp increase in OASW's membership, and our coffers became fuller. than they were prior to that time. Federal and provincial grants were received in 1986 to ensure the bilingualism of the association, and the provincial office at 410 Jarvis Street in Toronto was purchased to secure a permanent home for the association, and we still operate out of 410 Jarvis and are fortunate to be one of the few small associations that actually has property, and that I understand was terribly contentious at the time. It was not seemly, I gather, for a social work association to be owning property. Project legislation had many tentacles during the mid-80s. We sought inclusion in as a regulated under the Ministry of Health at that time, because the Ministry of Health was beginning a review of discipline-specific acts, which then came under the umbrella of the Regulated Health Professions Act. We were denied that request, and it was being seen as, our regulation was seen as being the purview of the Ministry of Community and Social Services. We weren't seen as meeting the definition of health. In '87, a levy of $50 was placed on membership fees so we could increase our activities and focus on securing legislation. And by the end of the decade, the need for regulation of social work to include the regulation of social service workers fully emerged, with the government developing a paper and inviting on social work regulation and inviting the unions and the community colleges to be a part of it. And although they were very actively opposed to regulation of the profession, they were very clear that if the profession were to be regulated, that social service workers need to be regulated as well. Examples of OASW's advocacy during that time related to consultations around SARC, which was the Social Assistance Review, and response to recommendations in the Transitions Report. This may sound familiar to those of you in the front row here. We became also a provincial partner of Campaign 2000 with the goal of eliminating child poverty. OASW produced 2 handbooks, one on violence against women and one on child abuse, and we also published a statement on HIV/AIDS, a social work perspective, in response to the devastating impact of this condition.